Bloom.
Okay, got it.
And we're live, and we'll let it count up a little bit because when we're making a podcast out of this, we don't want to cut off the beginning. We have a nice, punchy, snappy beginning. It'd be a shame if this was lost.
Oh, yeah, this is the good stuff right here.
When you set your Week 16 lineup, is there a check mark next to the name Mike Boone? That more this week on the couch. I'm not even saying all the words because it's Week 16. I've got Paul Charchian. It's a Minnesota show. Mike Boone in our lineups this week, Paul.
Yes, Mike Boone's in lineups. Let's talk about the running back situation. Yeah. Let's start here. Vikings haven't said it, but Alexander Madison's got a high ankle sprain, almost certainly. You don't have to have verbal acknowledgement of it. You just have to look at what they did. They put last week, they went to the Steelers practice squad and got somebody. He's got a hyphen in his name. It's Oladupa.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Dupa. And that tells you all you need to know. It's not a short-term injury. I think it's going to be a high ankle sprain, and I don't think we're going to see Alexander Madison to the playoffs. So then what do you do with Dalvin Cook? And, where does he reside with this? Well, Adam Schefter last night said he doesn't think Cook will play. The Vikings are almost certainly headed to a locked wild card spot. The only way that they can win the division at this point is if the Packers lose out and the Vikings win out. The Packers have the Lions next week, Sig.
Right.
So I don't think there's a lot of upside in risking Dalvin Cook on Monday night. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a really good player, Mike Boone, who most of your viewers / listeners aren't going to know. He's really good, Sig.
Yeah,
he's a good player. I really think he would be a starting running back for the Bears and the Buccaneers and the Dolphins and 10 teams in this league. He'd be good enough to be the starting running back. So I really believe they're gonna go to war with him. Wouldn't be surprised if Dalvin Cook is active for this game, but only in an emergency role. And Amir Abdullah is the number 2. So that's how I think this one's going to go down based on what we know right now, Tuesday afternoon, and just reading the tea leaves a little bit.
Yeah, and I think that part, and people who listen to the show regularly, when Mike Boone name comes up, I get excited. And Mike Boone and Raheem Mostert, Paul, were the two guys that were right on the fringe of my dynasty rosters this year.
Yeah,
because they both had that moment for me where I watched them and I thought, this guy's good.
Yeah.
But the team doesn't necessarily manage them like they're a crucial piece. So you're constantly, keeping a third string running back when you could have players whose value can actually take significant ticks forward because they're getting chances to play. But Mike Boone has always looked outstanding, and he looks like an outstanding fit for this running game, and it's a running game that's potent. The only real risk of playing Mike Boone this week is that it's kind of an anticlimactic game for the Vikings, as you indicated, because as long as Green Bay can win in Detroit, and Detroit's one of the 5 worst teams in the league right now, they may end up with Chase Young. It could happen. They can't win the division. Let's just pan out. And a lot of what we'll talk about today that are like specific meat and potatoes fantasy stuff is just early week 16 temperature checks on the decisions people are making. And, this all goes to DFS lineups. And the first step for me, Paul, always is just kind of getting a picture of the range of outcomes for the game, like how the ebb and flow of a game script can come together, the factors behind that, and then whether that's creating more of a chance of underachievers or overachievers on each side of the ball. When you look at the Vikings game, and I am a little worried about that anticlimactic nature.
Yeah.
And also that, so really, Paul, the tougher question than Mike Boone might be Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen. I'm not playing Kirk Cousins at this point. I don't think so. But I think both of these teams are going to be content. It's like two boxers that go into the middle of the ring and just clench, and the ref comes and breaks them up. It's just, come on, punch your way out. A 21-16 kind of game. Aaron Rodgers on the other side on this one. I think that he's outside of our circle of trust now. So what do you forecast on Monday night? Is it going to be anticlimactic, or will they bring it for the home crowd? Will the home crowd make them bring it?
Well, the Rams game will dictate a lot because the Rams are the only threat to knock the Vikings out of the playoff picture entirely. If the Rams lose, that effectively locks in the Vikings into the 6th seed, and that does take a lot of the drama out. Now, if the Rams win, the Vikings still have to keep the foot on the accelerator. Right. And at that point, I think they're going to go out and win the game. And I think they'll have to try, and I think that would bring in Kirk Cousins. I just don't think the Rams are going to win.
No.
It seems unlikely, doesn't it, given the ups and downs of the Rams and where the Niners are right now. And so I think your point is fair that there just doesn't have the normal gravity for a Vikings-Packers game between two heated rivals. Now, you brought up Aaron Rodgers.
Right.
As he's had 4 really good games, Sig. And in those 4 games, just if you were to just take those weeks, he's the highest scoring quarterback across fantasy football in those weeks. The rest of his weeks, he's down to quarterback 39 in the other weeks. And there's only 32 teams.
Exactly. Yeah.
Over the last 5 games, over the last 6 games, excepting the blow-up game against the Giants, because he has these one big games.
Right.
The other 5 games, he's averaged 179 yards and 0.8 touchdowns. And that's how you get to be quarterback 39. And that's a pretty big sample size in an NFL season when we're spreading across 6 games. So the upside, though, is the Vikings cornerbacks are just awful.
Right.
Xavier Rhodes and Trey Waynes and Mike Hughes is an instant third down conversion. If it's so bad, those 3 cornerbacks by Pro Football Focus rank 72, 83, and 111. They're your starting 3 outside cornerbacks. And so I think there is still a chance that Aaron Rodgers, if they decide they want to go out and win this game, and if they put all their full effort into it, then I think there's a chance that Aaron Rodgers ends up with one of those blow up games, because I can't tell you that the Vikings can even defend Marquez Valdez-Scantling at this point.
So you're right. This is a tough one to gauge because you can talk yourself in or out of it.
Yeah.
The interesting thing too, when you look at the crazy spikes in Rodgers' year that you pointed out, is they coincide almost perfectly with bad matchups. I mean, matchups against bad defenses.
Yeah.
Philly, Oakland, Kansas City has gotten it together. And that's the thing we always have to remember is players, units change over the course of a season. And then you mentioned the Giants, and then, performances, especially against tough defenses, skewing it downward. But the first time against Minnesota, and that's the other interesting thing about some of these games, is we have episode 1 to compare it to. Rodgers really came out hot and did whatever he wanted against the Vikings, but they were so hot that they took the foot off the gas and just kind of coasted into home, and the Vikings got back into that game by the end of it. But you're right, the Vikings, it reminds me of some of my love-hate relationships with Steelers defenses, where if the pass rush doesn't get home, someone's going to get open.
Yeah.
So you better hope the pass rush gets home. That's the state of the Vikings. So, there is a lot of upside. There is a chance for this game to turn into a shootout, but I'm just mostly excited about Mike Boone. And it can be one of those fantasy football things where I've been expecting Mike Boone to make an impact at some point for so long. So I'm so eager. I'm just so eager. And he did score twice, and it was a blowout. But I think people are going to see that there's not physically a drop-off from Dalvin Cook to Mike Boone, and Boone is a skilled player too. He can apply his gifts to the game.
And Sig, especially a recent incarnation of Dalvin Cook, who's been playing hurt for a month now and just hasn't been effective. His longest run over the past 5 games is 9 yards. And Dalvin Cook was explosive for so much of the first half of the season. I do think that Boone steps right into this offense in much the manner that we saw in the third and fourth quarter last week. And you don't see a material difference. And by the way, good matchup. Packers are still 4.7 per carry against. So this is a really nice opportunity. They've given up 14 rushing touchdowns to running back. So it is a nice opportunity for Boone. Yeah. Even if emotionally you and I are on the same page here, and we want him to succeed because we think it's a certain amount of karmic justice for the ability set that he's got.
Absolutely. And you're right that the tendency of Minnesota fits well to attack the underbelly of the Packers defense against a good running game. Sometimes they look like a team. Remember the Philly game? I mean, sometimes they just can't get off the field against a good running game. And absolutely, this is set up for, DFS lineups too. This is set up for Mike Boone to be, as you pointed out, even better than what Dalvin Cook at this point in the season would be, which pops into my head, Paul, just as an aside. It does seem like teams are starting to wise up to not running backs don't matter, but don't invest in running backs.
Yeah.
Especially after the way the last 2 or 3 big contracts broke. But I wonder if teams, because we see it in fantasy football, it's one of the things that's always been fun, Paul. I think that at this point, and you as one of the progenitors of the fantasy football industry should feel great about this. I think that fantasy football is really part of the the factory that makes professional football now. Like,
for sure.
Not just our interest, not just the way we drive the conversations about the game, but that we see things clearly in a way that people inside the game can't. Like, we just want to harvest advantages, and because of that, we just look for these things and they present themselves. And one of the things I'm wondering is, so in fantasy football, when these running backs, sometimes of lesser talent or gifts, get opportunities late in the season, we talk about it every year, these fantasy football running backs that win your league that weren't on any roster or any radar.
Yeah. The Rondanes of the world.
Sure.
Raheem Mostert this year.
D. Brown, whatever.
Brown,
there's so many of them over the years, right? And could it be, Paul, that with the exception of really outstanding running backs, there's a few that, either were indestructible over the years, like Adrian Peterson, or guys that add so many layers to your offense. I mean, like Christian McCaffrey or LaDainian Tomlinson back in the day. There are going to be exceptions, but might it be in teams' interests to, like a closer in baseball, come like kind of how Tennessee was using Derrick Henry recently, in recent years before this year, just the lesser running back that has fresh legs is going to be the better running back. I think we're seeing it with Alvin Kamara and Latavius Murray, where these running backs aren't the same as they were in September, October, often following an injury. Anyway, what do you think?
I agree with all of that. It is a destructible position, it's a replaceable position, and it's the running backs, notoriously the short lifespans. And the funny thing, and I really do think that you can get a pretty good gauge of this by just cracking open your preseason cheat sheet from 3 years ago, which isn't that long ago, and rolling your eyes at how many of these guys are even viable, how many are even in the league now, how many have a meaningful role today. And even if you even just go back 3 years ago, half of these guys are just completely off radars. And it's just the nature of the position. Now, for dynasty owners or Empire League owners that are thinking about Dalvin Cook for years from now, he'll have one more year with the Vikings. And at that point, he's probably not a Viking anymore. Right. Alexander Mattison will very likely be the starting running back. I don't think they're going to pay Dalvin Cook free agency style money to stay with Minnesota at that point. And so for people that are taking a long-term view of the Vikings running back situation, if you're thinking about winning beyond 2020, then Alexander Madison's the right guy to hold.
Yeah, or Mike Boone.
I'm not taking that off the table.
No.
Mike Boone's going to come up for free agency maybe at the same time.
I think so. Well, and look, and there's something I've talked about a couple of times already this week, Paul, that it's nice to see coaches like Kyle Shanahan just came out and said it. The assumption of rational coaching throws us for loops because we see players, our eyes tell us that is a guy that can get it done.
Yeah.
And coaches don't necessarily treat them that way, even if they should continue to show it in small doses. And then, like Kyle Shanahan said about Raheem Mostert, well, now he's given us no choice but to play him.
Right.
And I think that Mike Boone could absolutely do that this week. I mean, he absolutely have a kind of performance this week and next week, and maybe even in the playoffs, that makes the coaches say, okay, well, we had Alexander Mattison ahead of him clearly because of what they invested in him, which means they thought highly of him to begin with.
Yeah.
But teams and fantasy football players too would be better off just forgetting where a player was drafted or how they were acquired, like within months of acquiring them, and just seeing them soberly for what they are. Because it skews, like Ryan Riddle said, early round draft picks have to prove they can't play, where late round draft picks have to prove, or undrafted players have to prove they can. Mm-hmm. So those other players are going to get those opportunities. But you bring up a really good point too about the curves at running back, because some of these guys that have been getting the big contracts, like Bell and Gurley and David Johnson, they're going off the cliff in fantasy.
They are. Yeah,
sure. Gurley's not even old.
No, although plenty of wear and tear. But all three of those are three great examples of maybe the three biggest contracts in the NFL. Right. All three teams regret those deals.
Right.
None of them would sign that deal today if they knew what they now know what they know. None of those teams would. And if you think other general managers aren't aware of that, of course they are. By the way, just briefly on Mostert, and I agree that it was great that Shanahan came out and just said, he's forced the issue. We know that Shanahan wants to run this by committee, but he's got to get most of his touches. He was still only on the field for half of the plays.
Yeah.
I'm like, geez, come on. What more does he have to do? He's 6.5 yards per carry, for Pete's sake. Frustrating, but yeah,
it is. Well, it's Kyle Shanahan. I mean, it's the nature. One of the interesting things we've had to endure this year and absorb is the idea of when the offensive genius can turn against us. That when the offensive genius doesn't evolve or is too mesmerized by their own brilliance to see what's happening and change. And you wonder if Kyle Shanahan, I can't believe he didn't put together a game plan to take advantage of Isaiah Oliver and Kendall Sheffield starting at corner with Samuel and Sanders. But
right.
Anyway, let's also talk about Breshad Perriman.
Yeah, let's
in the same vein. I mean, do you plug him right into your lineup? I mean, he had one of the biggest games of the year, and it's Jameis Winston, and it's Houston. Seems elementary.
It does. We've all been snake bit on these sorts of situations in the past, and we're all sensitive to not chasing last week's box score, but it checks every box. I mean, everything would suggest this is green light for a player who mostly is run straight, run fast. Jameis Winston's the perfect quarterback for that skill set. You can't ask for a better situation than that, I don't think. And that's part of why I think he's been successful in spots to this point of the year. And then just they're short, obviously, as their number 1, number 2, and number 4 receivers are all gone, so they have almost no choice but to throw to him. Houston's Bradley Roby's back, but he's not the Bradley Roby of the Broncos era anymore. And I feel like this is a very good opportunity for Perriman. I believe he will probably be wide receiver 18. It'd be that's
sure.
my right about now. Something
you're
like that.
Drafting him. You're starting him over some wide receivers you drafted, expecting never to bench them in week 16. Let's put it that way.
Yes. Yeah. And to that point, never stop trying to put together the best lineup. I really think owners get into the playoffs, and they feel like by virtue of having gotten into the playoffs, it validates the roster that got me to week 14.
Right.
And that's some sort of seal of approval of both me and my abilities that got me here and the roster that I've got. And they shut down, and they don't keep working the waiver wire. They don't have the guts to start a guy like a Breshad Perriman. And I think there's a psychological change that happens in too many owners that they really think that that their roster's been blessed by the playoff gods and that they don't have to keep working, but you really do. You still have to treat every week as its own individual matchup in which you have to battle to get the best roster you can.
And keep updating the conventional wisdom that you're working with as the background for your decisions.
Great point.
I put this stuff out there into the ether, and who knows, I'm probably setting a trap for myself when I say I wonder almost if you ran the numbers of whether the second half of the season is more predictive of week 16 results than the season as a whole.
Yeah.
Or we could even put in a third column like ADP. Although we already know once we get a month into the season, ADP is less predictive than the data we have. Yeah. But yet, as you point out, psychologically, ADP or what we invested in a player still is tugging on us in some ways. So let's just go, Paul. Let's just rapid fire, because I really like talking about everything but fantasy football with you. But I want to talk fantasy football to help people out. So I just want to rapid fire go through. We already talked about Aaron Rodgers, and I think that let me put it this way: someone asked me this week, Ryan Fitzpatrick or Aaron Rodgers. Paul, I'm going to say Ryan Fitzpatrick. I mean, and like you said, there's an extra piece of data of what happens in that Rams game. And that's Saturday. So Sunday we can think about this, even though the Aaron Rodgers playing on Monday. I'm going to be inclined to break more ties against Aaron Rodgers this week.
Sure.
So this is kind of like the framework without having specific data points. But I suppose as we go through it, we can start comparing and contrasting some of these guys against each other. Okay. So let's start here. Let's see. Any hesitation at all after last week on Julian Edelman?
Yeah, I've got a ton. He's multiple injuries that he's dealing with. Clearly, was not part of that game plan in a meaningful way, and I think it's a reflection of the injuries that he's got. I worry that they're already thinking about making sure Edelman's going to be playoff ready for them, and if that means that he's going to be a 2-target a game guy down the stretch, fine, so be it. They'll try to win with N'Keal Harry and Jacoby Myers, and I just think they'll find other players if they have to, and that's always been their way. And so for me, because of the injuries, I'm nervous. I've got him going in a finals game, and I'm planning to start Adam Thielen over him because I just don't trust him to be part of this until he's healthier. And of course, we're going to get no meaningful injury information between now and kickoff. So, it's hard to go by much more than what we saw last week. And what we saw last week was a team that clearly didn't want him taking a lot of abuse.
In this game, when you picture this Buffalo New England game also on Saturday, it's going to be a good Saturday of football.
It is a good Saturday slate, isn't it?
It really is. This feels to me to be like struggle, like lots of sumo wrestling, just these two things clashing, immovable objects trying to push each other. And that was the first game, 16-10, I think, in New England. One of their touchdowns, I don't know if it was a touchdown set up by a block punt or actually off for the block punt. Anyway, the point is not a lot of offensive success in the picture of this game. So it's easy to break ties against players in this game. What about the Buffalo trio of Josh Allen, who scratched out a decent, an acceptable result against a tough Pittsburgh defense?
Yeah, with the help of the touchdown run.
Yes, but that's what he's there for. Yeah, Devin Singletary, who's a volume play. There's a lot of running backs this week who are like volume plays. Like Philip Lindsay comes to mind. He's got a matchup. Players that are going to be the lead back for their team, but is that enough to persuade you to start them? And then Smokey, John Brown, who did have, I think, 5 for 67 in the first matchup, but looming is Stephon Gilmore. You putting Bills in your lineup?
Mostly no. That's in championship week. I hope I don't have to play anybody against New England, but if I'm going to play one, it's going to be Singletary, both from a skill set standpoint, because he can be electrifying and he can break long runs, but also because it's so hard to pass in New England and there are chinks in the armor against the run. We just saw Joe Mixon put up 136 yards on the ground. We've seen other, reasonably successful games on the ground against them. Now they've only given up the one rushing touchdown, which is a huge problem. But as a potential flex starter, I think Singletary would be the guy that I would want to go with. I don't like the notion of trying to pass on Stephon Gilmore and the rest of that secondary.
No, and Josh Allen looked overmatched in that game.
Yeah.
The first one, really overmatched. But he's evolved, and the no huddle came online. I think the whole offense took a step forward when that happened. We'll see. Some of my karma here, Paul, I try to be pretty neutral, although I've been kind of anti-Patriots this year. I understand. I mean, it's just a feeling, I'm just sharing. I'm human. And as much as I've made fun of the Patriots offense this year, the Steelers offense is worse.
It's bad.
It's worse, Paul.
Yeah.
James Conner, Deontay Johnson, James Washington, but it's the Jets, Paul, and the Steelers need to win to stay on track. Do we like it?
Well, the Jets' run defense up until last week has been borderline awesome all year.
Yeah.
So I'm not touching any of the running backs, and they've clearly identified the fact that they can't keep playing James Conner, in a workhorse role. And we saw that last week. He was on the field for a little over 50% of the snaps, and that's it. And I just think that's all he can give you anymore. And they know that. So, it's one thing to try to scratch out a decent game against that Jets run defense with a workhorse back who's going to touch the ball 22 times. It's another thing with James Conner, who might be looking at 12 touches or 14 touches, and it just isn't enough. So I don't want any part of the running game. And then you got to ask yourself, how much do you believe in Duck Hodges to exploit a bad secondary? It seems like he's good for a couple of long receptions a game. And that's about it. And that to me is not anything bankable in week 16. Do you feel
Washington is interesting to me because Duck throws downfield to him, and he can get in a groove. I think that something like a 4-110 touchdown game is not at all out of the question for him. And then Johnson's been really dynamic after the catch, and he's getting enough targets that, continuing with these kind of lines for him wouldn't surprise me either. Somewhere around 5-6 catches, 60 yards, and a chance at a touchdown. But I do think that you have hesitation because of Hodges. And what's interesting about that, again, since it's on the couch and it's psychological, if we're pausing and we're saying my perception of this player as a shepherd of fantasy value has changed, the player himself is probably having some questions. The team, it's like a hive mind thing where the Hodges and the Steelers offense was so bad. It's really Randy Finkner, fire Finkner. I mean, Paul, I watch football every week. and I see, and it's probably because it's my team that it seems so glaring.
Yeah.
That it's not just a coach not helping the team, but it's a coach that's an impediment to success. It's like the Adam Gase thing that's everyone's been ignoring. Well, really, Paul, narrative matters in fantasy football. And if you thought, hey, here's a possibility, Adam Gase is toxic, and I'm going to avoid Le'Veon Bell, and I'm going to avoid Robbie Anderson, and I'm going to be more open to Devontae Parker bouncing back. I'm going to be more open to Kenyon Drake playing like the player that we saw. I'm going to be more open even to Ryan Tannehill being a material upgrade from Marcus Mariota. If you had placed firmly in your consciousness, Adam Gase might be an anchor to players' ability to be their best, you were out ahead of important developments this year.
Absolutely.
And that's how I feel about the Steelers offense right now. But at the same time, Duck don't care. And he's going to wing it, so to speak, downfield. And James Washington goes after the ball like a frisbee catching dog, So,
yeah. So of the two, Johnson and Washington, who will be higher on your preseason cheat sheet next year with Ben Roethlisberger at the helm?
Wow. I mean, I still think Johnson is barely scratching the surface. I think Washington's a nice piece, and he is what he is. But I think Johnson is a player, and because he had his best game in week 14, coming off the heels of his worst game in his rookie year, week 13. He's going to level off. This is a little turbulence on takeoff, but of course, things can still change. What happens in these last few weeks can still be very meaningful. Okay, the toughest call this week, Paul.
Yeah.
In terms of that situation we talked about with all the considerations, is Odell Beckham. Odell Beckham against Baltimore. Odell Beckham against Baltimore, Paul, my first reaction is like, well, he's just going on my bench. Like I'm playing one of these Steelers receivers over him. You know what I mean? Like I'm thinking like, as long as I've got an option that I feel semi okay about, Darius Slayton, whoever, I mean, at least 25 or 30 deep, probably. Am I overreacting here, or is it really just the fact that it's what Odell Beckham's done in the past haunting us that's even giving us pause?
I think the only reason you'd consider it is because he got targeted 13 times last week, and there seems to be a maybe. And by the way, I'm not ruling out the notion that Freddie Kitchens is trying to placate him heading into an offseason by getting him the ball so much and giving him so many opportunities for personal success that he'll fall in line and won't create an offseason problem for the team. And if you're the Browns, that's as much of an incentive as anything right now and for that coaching staff. This is it's a Baltimore pass defense that by and large has been awesome once they got Jimmy Smith back and teamed him up with Marcus Peters. Almost entirely great. Now Jamison Crowder, got a little something done from the slot, but that's not going to be Odell. So I think it'd be hard to make a case. I think it's hard to make a case to start him. By the way, 20 yards for Odell Beckham in the first meeting between the two.
And this is better. And didn't Cleveland blow out Baltimore in that game, dude? That was weird. That was like one of the weirdest games of the year. I think it was.
I think Cleveland
won that game.
40. I'm looking at it now. 40 to
25.
Yeah. How about that?
And I don't even think the game was that close. And the Steelers took Baltimore to overtime. But this is, again, we keep coming back to that theme of like the most recent data or staying in the now and not being too informed by expectations and how our expectations weren't met. And by the way, another story that we tell of the 2019 season, an Odell Beckham and the great letdown, Baker Mayfield, the great letdown, again, coaching, Freddie Kitchens. And everyone keeps pointing out that Bob Wiley, one of everyone's favorite like NFL coaching cult figures, he nailed it when he said that John Dorsey, it wasn't Freddie Kitchen, it was Zampese that was responsible for the success, and this wasn't going to go well. Cleveland's going to Cleveland. And I do like that you bring up on Narrative Street the idea of, well, the game plan might be skewed by this, speaking of turbulence, rough spot they're in. And that's about the only argument you can make for Odell Beckham right now.
Intangibles are about the best reason, because if you put it on paper and try to back up any assertion, it's awfully hard right now to start Odell Beckham.
Exactly.
And by the way, man, would I like to rewind our on the couches from the preseason. I was more wrong about him than any take I had. At one point, I had Odell as high as number 1 on my wide receiver list. You and I talking in like June or July, he was number 1. By the time we got into late August, I had him all the way down at 5. As it turns out, it should have been closer to 50.
Right.
And
right, exactly.
I really believed in the talent and thought that I really thought Baker Mayfield was going to be incrementally better than he was last year, and we misread the whole thing.
Yeah. Right. What I really got caught in, I got my toe snagged in a little loop. Paul, what I picture right now is like Eli Manning is hanging out in the corner being like, "Hey guys, not so bad, huh? I'm still pretty good, huh?"
Right.
Because I thought, well, if Odell Beckham was putting up these kind of numbers with Eli, and he's going to get on like a draft, like an upward draft with Baker Mayfield's career development.
Right.
Like, here we go.
Yep.
And instead we're to, who's Odell Beckham going to play for next year? That being said, at least, we saw Nick Chubb is everything Nick Chubb it could be. For fantasy, there's even more there if this offense just had more success. And then Kareem Hunt is still Kareem Hunt. That's going to be an interesting thing to watch.
Oh, yeah. What a fast
in the offseason.
You're in dynasty or empire leagues, and you're thinking about, what Kareem Hunt could mean to you.
Oh, yeah.
What a fascinating roll of the dice. Let's say you don't have Hunt. What a fascinating roll of the dice to go acquire him before March.
Yeah.
And, roll the dice on where he ends up, what that situation is going to look like. He'll be the lead running back somewhere, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, eventually. Well, Paul, almost like with running backs in dynasty, and this is going to be a big part of. I keep telling myself to do this every year at the beginning of the offseason, and I forget by the time the season gets there, of really understanding in the first 2 rounds which of those players have a chance to catch that updraft. It has to be, for running backs, a player on the upward side. I think Dalvin Cook, even going into this year, I don't know if we'll argue that out of this year, a player still on the upward side of their career arc at running back. And I think one of the things we talked about earlier in the show already is that peak, that parabola is going to be like narrower. Maybe the mountain top might be higher, but the drop off is coming earlier. And then you're starting to look for the running backs that still haven't started to ascend yet.
Mm-hmm.
And you wonder like how this turnover is going to go, like poor Breshad Perriman. But, Penny, it's like, Carson's going to hand it off to Penny at some point, or Mack is going to hand it off to Wilkins, or it's it's going to be interesting because I think that grasping the way this churn is speeding up, and some of it makes sense because it's just they get more athletic in the speed of the game. It's just more brutal. I mean, just the punishment.
Yeah,
it's incredible. I mentioned it already once a week or two ago. Was it Chris? I think it was Chris Borland, who was the linebacker for Wisconsin and then San Francisco, who just walked away from the game.
Yeah, like in year 2 or something.
Yeah, and he said there was a perception flip where he remembered like players in Wisconsin getting lauded for playing on like one good limb, and he looks back and he's like horrified by it. It's like, just like wow. And sometimes when you watch a hit in an NFL game and you see what it does to a player's body, how they watch the force, you can really watch the force like ripple through their body. You just feel like, and the running back position is the one where this is really reflected within a season and over the course of the careers. Since I mentioned Marlon Mack, by the way, Marlon Mack is a classic fantasy football dilemma of no momentum for the offense, no momentum for the player, but Carolina looks like blocking sleds.
Yeah.
And they're starting Will Grier. For that matter, we can go off and talk about what that means too. What about Marlon Mack? Do you make a leap of faith, even though he hasn't been getting the wheel to turn?
Yeah, and not only that, but he's also not getting requisite usage. Not only is he just not passing the eye test like he did for what there was a stretch in the first half of the season where Marlon Mack looked terrific.
Yeah. He had clearly taken a step forward as a player. Like he looked even better than the last time we saw him, and he wasn't bad the last time we saw him.
So then he gets hurt, nagging injuries. He misses a couple of games, and a little bit like Alvin Kamara, you miss these games, you come back and you try to play hurt, and you're just not. It's just not the same, and it's going to really put fantasy owners in a tricky spot going into next year, where you're going to have to try to evaluate this and say, well, Marlon Mack's going to roll into next season healthy, and when healthy, Marlon Mack was really good last year. But what we remember is a November and December in which he gave us no help whatsoever and looked utterly mundane and couldn't hold off Jordan Wilkins. And, and there's going to be a whole group of people out there that will like never start him again because of what happened last night at the goal line. Right. So I think he's going to be a fascinating case study, I think, for not his case study, but a fascinating decision for each of us to have to try to make as we roll into next season about which version of Marlon Mack we're expecting, and whether or not you'll make that investment.
Well, it's an investment in the Colts, which isn't bad because they have a good all-around team, a good offensive line. We'll see about their quarterback. This is going to be a really intriguing offseason for quarterback.
How about this? What would you think? What would you think of Jameis Winston being heading to Indianapolis and being teamed up with Frank Reich, presumably a healthy T.Y. Hilton? How, if that were to go down, that particular scenario, and it probably won't, but it could. I think Jacoby Brissett's lost. I think any faith they had in Jacoby Brissett is largely shattered at this point for him to be a starter. What do you think?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I could picture it. I mean, I could picture Cam Newton there. I could picture a lot of scenarios. I guess what's fascinating about this, Paul, keeping it with On the Couch, is you're trying to, from afar, psychoanalyze Frank Reich and Chris Ballard and think, are they going to see Jameis Winston? Like, everything's always comes into my head in terms of like marriage and relationships because of my own life, but also because of football. It's that kind of commitment and then commitment that you walk away from, right? And Winston's like, think of the classic cliche of a woman saying, I can change him, or I can, like when you look at Winston, you're like, oh, I can make it so we iron out those bad parts of his game and just take advantage of those parts of the game where sometimes playing quarterback comes so naturally to him. Like you take his 25 best plays of a year and he can put them next to any quarterback in the league in terms of like instinctive pocket presence, ability to negotiate, manipulate space, arm talent, like being able to have field vision and anticipate things. He'll make breathtaking plays, but then he'll take plays that knock the wind out of you because they're so terrible. Yeah. And I don't know if that's what I think of Winston, to cut to the chase. I think he's found his soulmate in Bruce Arians, I think that even whenever we were all backing away from Winston and saying, well, we know Tampa Bay is not going to go forward with Winston, Arians was saying, I don't think so. I think there's still, it's possible that it's actually very rational for Arians and the Tampa franchise and Winston to all say, this is going to get better. Like, we're going to get more used to each other. And maybe it's happening before our very eyes.
But there's a monetary component to it, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Jameis Winston is looking for the payday of his life, and if Tampa is not willing to pay what Indianapolis is,
right,
that might.
Well, when you put it that way, Paul, I think no. I think Chris Ballard has shown himself to be always erring on the side of being prudent. When it comes time to open the wallet. Tampa, not so much.
It's true.
So we'll see. It's fascinating to ponder all this stuff too. I mean, we're thinking about fantasy football finals. We're thinking about the playoffs in our teams and what's going to happen and who's going to make it to the Super Bowl. But looming is the wheels, the clockwork turning with all these other decisions and things going on. Let me ask you this. Let me turn this on its head and just ask you this, Paul. Are there any players that pop into your mind when you think of the toughest decisions in Week 16?
One of them that you mentioned that I think is a tricky decision is Ryan Fitzpatrick, who's been a top 5 quarterback now for the better part of 2 months. He's got Cincinnati, and what makes it really interesting, Cincinnati on paper looks like a terrific pass defense, but the reality is that teams they're so bad against the run, teams don't bother to pass.
Yeah.
But the Dolphins can't run. They have no ability to run.
Right.
So I think there's no team that's seeing fewer pass attempts than the Bengals are. But again, because Miami can't pass, I still think Fitzpatrick is going to air the ball out in just sheer volume that Cincinnati's not used to. And I think he's going to end up exposing William Jackson and especially B.W. Webb as the mediocre players that mostly they are. And I think there's a good opportunity for Fitzpatrick. And then there's also this little side angle. Fitzpatrick leads the Dolphins in rushing, which isn't saying a lot, but he's their leading rusher. The Bengals have allowed the most quarterback rushing yards and the most quarterback rushing touchdowns this year. And Fitzpatrick might just be a sneaky ground play as well and help you out in sneaky fashion that way. I think that's going to be a particularly tricky one for some fantasy owners.
Yeah, I'm going to be pushing people to put Fitzpatrick in the lineup. I mean, look, I'm going to do this really fast as an exercise. Like, here are the quarterbacks I know for sure I'm going to say are over, just so I can see where I stand. Watson, Tannehill, Lamar Jackson, of course, Patrick Mahomes, of course, Dak Prescott, Carson Wentz, Winston, even without his receivers. I mean, at this point, I'm just and maybe because
Russell Wilson against Arizona.
Russell Wilson and Kyler Murray's interesting. Kyler Murray is probably so where this gets hard. Breeze is in. Where it gets close is like with Fitzpatrick or Matt Ryan, Fitzpatrick or Jimmy Garoppolo or Jared Goff on either side of that matchup. But here's the thing. You mentioned about Fitzpatrick and running. To me, that's just an extension of like Ryan Fitzpatrick is out there to play some football.
Yeah, he's a gamer. He's a gamer.
Yeah, and he actually just got back Albert Wilson. So that's only going to help things. He has Isaiah Ford's playing pretty well. Alan Hearns is staying on the field. Got Mike Gesicki and of course Devontae Parker. And he's going to go out there and play. So he was good last week, even while they were at the other end of a drubbing by the Giants.
Yeah.
So I like the idea. Like I get a sense of calm when I'm picking among options that I have a hesitation for one reason or another. Just going with Ryan Fitzpatrick out of that group, because I know he's going to play the game as if like the way I would want him to play for like my fantasy interests. High risk, running, throwing downfield, trying to make things happen, and then the running game being so stationary just makes the better case for him. It's just fun, man. I mean, this is when I talk about this, Paul, I just think it's going to be really sad when we don't have Ryan Fitzpatrick around.
I know. Yeah, the game's worse without him, right?
Yeah.
The football's way more interesting with him. Nobody's likely starting Andy Dalton as their number one quarterback, but
as a quarterback two super
flex number two quarterback against Miami. There's going to be some temptation there. Now, he hasn't been very good since they brought him back, and frankly, wasn't that good before he got benched. But you know who else was not good? Eli Manning, Sam Darnold, Baker Mayfield, Mason Rudolph, Case Keenum, and they all threw multiple touchdowns against Miami. Most of those guys were benched at some point over the course of the year. And Dolphins are, this
exactly.
I have to tell you or any of your listeners how easy this is. I think Dalton makes for a terrific second quarterback for the upside that he potentially does bring.
Well, and of course you're playing Joe Mixon. That's not a question. But this implicates somebody like Tyler Boyd. That's about it. Maybe Alex Erickson if you're in super deep leagues. But I bring this up because you're right. And again, as you're putting all these things under the microscope and you're getting onto your last decision or two in your lineup this week, or even the way you put together your DFS lineup every week, you're weighing all these different factors. And in this case, it's matchup. And Miami has been like Popeye spinach for offensive players, like look with Saquon Barkley. I mean, so it's funny too, because I was thinking about OJ Howard and this idea that in fantasy we have that starts even before the season, the narratives even, starts the beginning of the next season. Like the narratives already starting about 2020 fantasy football now before 2019 is even over.
You and I
right?
2020 already have to.
Yeah. So there's this whole ride, this wild roller coaster ride. And from a sort of literary or story or narrative point of view, what will stay with us sometimes will be the ending, or it's just the ending of a story can change all of the story you heard before that. It can change the meaning of everything and the significance of it. Like, was the OJ Howard's season really about rewarding people who just said, I'm going to trust him in week 16? Like he's going to have 8 catches for 100 yards and a touchdown this week. Or Saquon Barkley last week, after all of the struggle, finally pushed you through to the next week the way that you knew or thought he would do 4 or 5 times this year when you took him. So it's just interesting to take these rides and then they make you or appeal to you on different levels when it's time to make your decision. But in the case of this one for Boyd or Dalton, it's how compelling is the matchup to you, because Miami is really playing with like, I think they said an AAF roster, I think so. I forget who said that. And you can really see that when the defense is on the field. So, and of course, draft implications there. Really hoping there's not a nightmare scenario where Cincinnati somehow wins their last 2 games and loses out on Joe Burrow, because that's something that needs to happen. Yeah, but, even if they end up number 2, it should be okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, look, folks, I want to say folks don't know. I always feel like when we get together, everybody that's listening to us, Paul, like knows us already. It's real comfy. But Paul Charchian, fan ball, guillotine leagues. Sorry, I made some bad decisions. I honestly didn't draft well enough to deserve to go to the final in the guillotine. We were together.
You stayed alive a long time. You made it to like week 10,
Scuffle.
week 11, something like that. That's not bad.
It's not, and it tests your ability to survive. It's a different fantasy football ability than some of the other ones. So guillotine leagues, folks, I know a lot of you've got the fever during the season. If you haven't checked that out, that's good. Fanball, copious amounts of rankings and things to help guide you, and we're out there. But we'll give an extra 5 minutes. It is the pineapple episode.
It is the
you know,
time of the episode, isn't it?
it is. It is.
So,
That's what,
if
go ahead.
I'd like to just pivot on something that you brought up earlier that I think bears a little more discussion, if you don't mind. You talked about players who walk away from the game, of which there are very few, when they don't need to. And I think it takes a special person in two ways. One, your money motivation needs to be pretty low. And most of us don't have that at all, or would struggle with that. And the second is a fame motivation. And those are two intoxicating things. Say money and fame are intoxicating, and blended together in particular, it makes it almost impossible to walk away. And that's why, I think that's why we see 1% of players who leave before they could. The running back for San Francisco, Coffey, he walked away from the game. And then you wonder, okay, but that's these professional athletes. What about you and I, and how do those things affect us? And I think I think we don't always take the time to be deliberate about happiness. And what are the things that fulfill us, and what are the things that make us happy and bring us true joy? Most of us don't have a fame component to our lives, but many of us have a money component. And I think there's something to be said about trying to be thoughtful and rational about all of the elements that bring you happiness in your life, and really then trying to reverse engineer the actions that you do to pour your time, effort, energy into things that bring personal happiness to you. And if you're an athlete that can walk away from football and the fame and the money, great. For us, regular people, it's smaller things, and maybe easier decisions. But I still think it requires some deliberative thought to the whole notion of happiness that we really don't. Most of us don't do very often. Our happiness comes in short spurts. Our happiness comes because we're eating an ice cream cone, or we're making out with our girlfriend, or we are, we got a slap on the back from our boss, or whatever, or we just went through the drive-through, or we watched a really good episode of Dark on Netflix, which I highly recommend. But those are the short little things that bring us just little hits of dopamine from here to there, and then they're gone. And I think it's important to be reflective of those things. And I think when you were talking about walking away from the game, that's what was going through my mind while you were talking.
There's 1,000 things flooding into my head. Like this, I wish we had like another hour or 2 hours, because I think what you're getting at, Paul, is what's at the crux of our spiritual and religious traditions. And Danny Aiello died this week. If you saw that.
Yeah.
Oh, God. So Danny Aiello and so many roles just stuck with me. He had an incredible presence, almost like and then one role in particular, Jacob's Ladder, which is an incredible film. He plays a character called Lewis the Chiropractor. And have you seen Jacob's Ladder?
I haven't. I've heard from others. Great, like you,
Tim Robbins. So I don't want to give away too much, folks. If you haven't seen Jacob's Ladder, check it out.
All right.
But let's just say that he's a guide or an angel in that movie. And he's helping Tim Robbins' character with the trials and tribulations of being on this plane and the tug of war. I always feel like so many of our spiritual religious traditions are basically they're all, not so many, all of them are about the tug of war between like the light and the dark, the higher and the lower, the animal and the spirit, the body, flesh and the spirit, your animal or your human instincts and things like that. And like you said, it almost seems like from a happiness perspective, there's like a lowercase h happiness, which is a desire fulfilled. Buddhism would direct us to feel like that's still the source of suffering, just chasing your desires fulfilled, desires unfulfilled, and happiness with a capital H, which one of the things I said earlier this year on the show, Paul, is that human interaction is like our oxygen, like being involved in each other's lives, like replenishes us, and unfortunately, and this is where I'm going to make it kind of political because that's just where it leads into my head. I do feel like capitalism, our capitalist culture, creates a hum that we're turning our crank, we all have our little part of the machine that we're turning that makes the dollars come out so we can live our lives. But what drowns out the voice that you're talking about, the voice you have to hear to walk away from football, because it's even bigger than just giving up fame and happiness and money. I mean, I'm sorry, I see my brain Freudian slip there. Fame and money, but say fame and money are often conflated with happiness in our culture.
Yeah. Well, for sure.
So Freudian slip's instructive there. Paul, it's bigger than saying I'm walking away from fame, I'm walking away from money. It's saying I'm walking away from something that I have probably spent the better part of a decade or more aiming my life at. And also dozens of people around me have thrown in their lot. Like it's almost like a space program and the rocket ship's the player, like all these people have to come together to make a professional football career. And to walk away from that and to hear that voice, well, it's like Chris Borland described it. I think it was just like a moment where your perception flips, religious experience, if you will. I'm sure that, you could map the brain in these moments and see how these epiphanies happen, and you can never see things the same way again,
Yeah.
And I think that those moments are in some ways like what we are seeking, right? Like to break the trance. I've often said, Paul, that if I can serve one purpose, it's like snap people out of the feet. We all get that. We all sleepwalk at different points. Our brains are incredible, right? There was that thing about to actually hit a certain major league pitch. Your brain can't actually perceive any of it. Your brain's predicting what's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't actually, you can't react to stimulus to hit a major league pitch. Your brain is actually predicting what's going to happen correctly. And I think our brains do that for us in our lives, and keep kind of papering it ahead of us. So when we miss what's actually happening right in front of us, So this is just some of the stuff that brings up, but let
me interject this. There's, just to bring it back to football again for a minute. We all know this. We all know what happens to athletes when they leave the game. The bankruptcy rate is, like 50% or whatever, and these guys just crater. It'd be fascinating to talk to people in different parts of the having left football arc, right? I just left football and I'm still quasi-relevant, right? People still care what I think. They still recognize me on the streets. My local sports talk radio station still wants to book me and hear what I have to say. And then, as the months and the years go by and then the money runs out and they're irrelevant, nobody cares who they are or what they're doing anymore. And they got to go through that. They got to go through that cycle. And most of them find something else on the other side. Some don't and just crater permanently, but most find something to grasp onto at the other side of it. And boy, it would be fascinating to talk to them. You are the people that have gone through the arc and come out the other side. And what would you tell yourself as a player? What would you tell yourself as the player who just got cut for the last time and you're never going to play again? And the player who just got cratered. And what would be the advice that you'd give?
Right.
And I think that would be fascinating to find out what those people have gone through. And I think it largely does come back to happiness and trying to find fulfillment other ways. And maybe happiness is another word for fulfillment, but I think people are fulfilled by happiness, but more than they're fulfilled by the ice cream or, having played a new video game or, having made a purchase or whatever. I think it'd be fascinating to talk to those guys about that. And that's something I don't think I've ever done. And, with all the radio I've done or whatever, I don't know that I've talked to guys about that art.
Yeah, well, and there's different things that come up in this conversation, right? They say, football players going to college, like get an education for after football. And that's not necessarily about making money. So I have something to do with yourself, some other purpose, right? I've always definitely believed, I call it our destiny. And destiny doesn't imply like some sort of fixed, deterministic idea. But you can sense when you're getting closer or farther away through your personal relationships, through like how you spend your time, through how you sleep. That's why language is so instructive, Paul. We say things over and over again, and we forget sometimes that this is like guideposts to understand what's happening to us, like how you sleep at night, like how can you sleep at night? All these things come back to like, are you getting closer to your destiny or farther from your destiny on a day-to-day basis? Like, Chris Borland having that moment. But your destiny and how you define yourself and your purpose needs to be something, this is like, I'm thinking of The Wire, whenever they tell Jimmy McNulty, like, the job's never going to love you back, like there's other things, and what you're looking for is you may not find in that, right? And still, as human beings, we're gonna have other needs that aren't going to be met. So you talk about having education or a sense of a purpose or a destiny, spirituality. I think it makes so much sense that there are a lot of players that are just devoutly religious. That can be something that can help you find that. And look, football players are no different than any of us. I mean, they're trying to find that golden strand of meaning or purpose in their life and follow it. And sometimes that presents itself through football. But then when football is gone, how do you find it? And the other thing that pops into my head when you bring this up, Paul, is the idea that fame. So it's really wild. I mean, the idea of considering, like, when millions of people are giving you their attention, there's something happening there with energy, where I almost think of like smoking a cigarette, like whenever it's pulling through the cigarette and just turning into ash. Like, we are all collectively like smoking famous people, right? Like, we're using up their life force because they all report, like, not all, but a lot of them report like this feeling of like your life's not for you anymore. And like everybody, like you almost can't conceive of yourself anymore separate from this thing that everybody wants you to be, or that you have been to everybody. And football players have to deal with, like you said, like, it's almost like electricity to be plugged into that, like a crowd of 50,000 or 80,000 people, like just like roaring when you do something. Like, how do you just go back to regular life, like buying groceries and things like that?
And how do you find satisfaction in buying groceries?
Right.
It's not easy. And that's for all of us, right?
Right. Well, hopefully the uplifting part of it is, Paul, is that maybe that's the most satisfying thing, right? After, like, you feel the immense pressure of being part of that. And because there are players like Jerry Rice that sound like they're miserable the whole time.
Yeah, right. It's true to that. Yeah. Absolutely
miserable. It's like, I just want to be a human being again, and do things that human beings do. And that's immensely satisfying. So,
yeah, and and buying groceries can be satisfying if you've got your head, if you've gotten the right head for it, and if you decide and you think you're very conscious that you are caring for your family and you are buying groceries and you're cooking meals, and it's you are providing for people who love you and who you love.
Sure.
That can be very fulfilling, but it doesn't have the gratification that a stadium full of people cheering for you.
It doesn't have the buzz, that rush.
Yeah.
But then we have to find our ways to stitch that together, like you said. And you described it like helping support the people that I love, finding that meaning, finding that purpose. I always come back to Wings of Desire. I think I probably mentioned it like 7 times or 8 times, but Bruno Gans, one of the actors that plays the angels that watch the humans, and all the angels want is just to be a human and experience a human sensation, right? I remember when I traveled to India and you see the gleam in people's eye because it's the joy of participation, Paul. It's the joy that I get to be any part in this play, this grand, wild farce, tragedy, whatever it is. I'm in it. That's incredible. Like, why would I ask for anything more? I already have it with capital I. That's it. And then you get to decide what to do with it. But that's the daily struggle, right? And I think that, again, like I think of it in terms of, there's one video game going on, Paul, where you can see the score up on the screen, right? Like your bank account or your position on the organizational chart or how many followers you have or whatever.
Your kill ratio.
Sure. But the actual game, there's a kind of a score, but you don't get to see it. It's more just how you feel as you go through your life every day. And then maybe how that radiates to other people and is like viral, I mean, positive people create positivity around them, and negative people create negativity. And I know both sides of that coin very well. So I mean, it's all out there. Go ahead.
You and I have talked about this before, and I'm not going to go back to this again, but there are people that have this, you talk about positivity. There are people that just really believe that the world is filled with bad people, morons, people that are stupid, people that just want to hurt you. And man, that's a tough way to go through life. It really is, I think. And of course they never include themselves in that. They're never part of that problem. They're always at the apex and everybody else is the problem and they're stupid. That's a tough way to go through life. And I think just, and again, we've done whole pineapple segments on this.
Sure.
I think more often than not, when you give people the benefit of the doubt to be good, intelligent, caring people, that's the bulk of humanity most of the time. And I think that's the you're depriving yourself of half of the enjoyment of life when you effectively deplatform the rest of society away from yourself.
It's true. Although I think for the next episode, Paul, those people are hurt, and we have to do something to help with everybody's hurt. We try to do a little bit of that every week. We love you always, folks. Stay classy. Good luck.